Hello and welcome to the Drug Cultures Podcast. I'm Sky Hawthorne. This is my show. I do the music, I make the content. All opinions presented here are mine and mine alone. And here at Drug Cultures, my goal will be to tell stories about the cultural uses of psychoactive substances, be they past or present, with a particular focus on lesser-known stories that haven't received extensive media attention. In this episode of Drug Cultures, I'll be talking about Yemen, more specifically Khat, the country's incredibly popular stimulant shrub, and the way in which Western pundits consistently use it as a boogeyman to muddy the waters about why the country is experiencing such extreme economic and environmental hardships. Now, I've wanted to do an investigation into Khat from the moment I first heard about it, which was several years ago, because I found it remarkable that there was this psychoactive drug used by most of the country of Yemen that virtually nobody in the US seems to have heard of. Now, I had this idea, but like many ideas, I set it on the back burner where it was promptly forgotten. Until last fall, when Houthi rebels in Yemen began attacking commercial vessels in the Red Sea in protest of the Israeli bombardment of Gaza. With Yemen in the news again, despite much of the West knowing very little about its existence, I honestly cannot think of a better topic for the inaugural episode of the Drug Cultures Podcast. So let's start with a little bit of background. A number of psychoactive substances have had their origins in the Middle East, most notably coffee, which was originally grown in what is now Ethiopia before the rise and fall of empires, expansion of global trade, helped it proliferate across the globe, becoming the most ubiquitous and normalized psychoactive plant. The majority of the planet has some sort of coffee dependence, and this is generally recognized as a benign or even positive influence on society and human productivity. Now, coffee became an integral feature of Yemen's economy, and in fact, the mocha I just ordered from Pete's this morning got its name from a Yemeni port city called Al-Mocha. But while Yemeni coffee became world famous, another stimulating plant, also having originated from East Africa and spread to the Arabian Peninsula, was also enjoying immense regional popularity, but unbeknownst to the rest of the world. I'm speaking of Khatha edulis, a flowering plant that has different names in different cultures, but for the purposes of this episode, we'll call it by its most common name, Khat. Khat is a flowering shrub whose leaves are harvested, chewed fresh for hours at a time, and it's similarly ancient with hundreds of years of documented use. Some scholars have even argued that Islamic mystics in the Sufi tradition used to combine Khat with coffee to create a stimulating beverage whose pronunciation I'm totally going to butcher, kuhwa, which they used to stay awake for long hours of prayer and introspection. So why didn't Khat become world famous as well? Well, primarily, it's much harder to transport without rapid degradation of its active alkaloids and reduction in potency. So with all that being said, let's step back and talk a little bit about Yemen. And this might not seem related to drugs or to Khat, but it's important context for the rest of the episode. Now, for decades, Yemen has been an impoverished country due to factors that include dwindling oil reserves, a water shortage, and an influx of refugees from war-torn Somalia. But overshadowing all of this in terms of its devastating impact on Yemen's economy is the civil war that started in 2014, which saw the official government allying itself with a coalition that included Saudi Arabia and the United States to brutally crush an insurgency from a rebel group called the Houthis. Now, I won't go deep into the history of this civil war because, quite frankly, Yemeni politics is not my area of expertise, and this podcast would end up taking up far too much time. So if you're interested in the subject, there's lots of great scholarship out there. I highly recommend you all read it. I'm also not here to defend or advocate for the Houthis. They're a Shia fundamentalist group with their own history of bigotry and extremism. That being said, their rebellion was not without material triggers. At the time of the start of the war, the people of Yemen had overthrown their former dictator, President Saleh, and elected President Hadi, who was only supposed to govern through 2014. But Hadi began indicating he might attempt to stay in power indefinitely, and discontent with his government, which was seen as corrupt and undemocratic, became widespread. The country was also running an enormous budget deficit as its oil reserves dwindled, and Hadi's government chose to accept a $560 million loan from the International Monetary Fund on the condition that they end their mass fuel subsidies, which were a lifeline to millions of impoverished Yemenis. Overnight, fuel prices nearly doubled. Now, I, for one, find it incredibly unsurprising that when people in one of the world's poorest countries are suddenly unable to afford basic necessities, it would lead to a popular rebellion. For every Houthi fighter driven by religious fundamentalism, how many were driven simply by the fact that their current government was unable to meet their basic needs? Needless to say, as the Houthis took control of Yemen's most populous cities in the northwest, the response from the internationally recognized Yemeni government became increasingly horrific. A Saudi-led coalition, funded and armed in part by the US and the UK, saw the possibility of a Houthi government in Yemen as a way that Iran might be able to exert influence in the Arabian Peninsula, and starting in 2015, enacted a complete blockade of Houthi-controlled areas in Yemen. And this triggered one of the worst humanitarian crises in the world, characterized by mass starvation, lack of medical supplies, lack of clean water, and millions of civilians displaced. Some experts have gone as far as to call the Saudi-led blockade and bombing campaign a genocide, on account of the tens of thousands killed in bombings alone and the incalculable number of civilians who might have been saved if humanitarian aid had been allowed to enter the country. Despite this horror, the war in Yemen has also been referred to as an invisible war because of how little media attention it's gotten in the Western press. That is, until a few months ago, when the Houthis began attacking commercial vessels passing through the Red Sea. In November of 2023, Houthi militants hijacked the commercial shipping vessel Galaxy Leader, holding its 25 crew members hostage and diverting it from its scheduled voyage from Turkey to India. This story captured the attention of the media. Well, one, it's a great story, but also there was feverish debate, with some pundits claiming that the Houthis were acting as Iranian proxies, whereas the Houthis were claiming that they were simply attempting to use whatever leverage they had to stop Israel's carpet bombing of Gaza. It's worth noting at the time of recording this episode that that military campaign has killed over 30,000 Palestinian civilians at a minimum, and the International Court of Justice has ruled that it might plausibly constitute genocide. Now, videos broadcast by the Houthis spread like wildfire on social media, including many that appeared to show the militants and crew members laughing and singing together, and, wouldn't you know it, also showed the Houthis handing out bundles of leafy green shrubs to the crew members. For many Americans, the Yemeni hijacking of the Galaxy Leader was the first time they'd paid attention to Yemen, as well as the first time they'd heard of Khat, its most widely used psychoactive plant. Despite hardly being known in the United States, the shrub is used by as much as 90% of Yemen's men and up to 50% of its women, who chew it in the afternoons for its stimulating, pro-social, and appetite-suppressing effects. Now, by all accounts, Khat is a fairly benign herb in terms of its pharmacologic effect. Its primary active alkaloids, caffeine and cathinone, are central nervous system stimulants with amphetamine-like effects. But unlike most amphetamines, Khat's overdose potential is virtually non-existent. Extreme physical or psychological side effects such as heart failure or psychosis have been reported in relation to Khat use, but such incidents are rare and their direct connection to Khat is tenuous and unsubstantiated. Now, more common and well-documented side effects are irritability, dependence, and disruptions to sleep, which of course are side effects shared by widely consumed and culturally accepted substances worldwide, including caffeine, alcohol, and nicotine. This has not stopped government, media, and even scientific sources reporting on Khat cultivation and use in breathless and panicked language. A Time magazine article from 2009 asked the question, "Is Yemen chewing itself to death?" A Slate article from 2010 posed the question, "Why is Yemen so poor? Conflict, corruption, and Khat." A 2011 press release from the National Institutes of Health declared that khat's consequences are extremely negative and that it leads to, and I quote, a high prevalence of certain psychopathology. A 2018 article in The Economist described khat as, quote unquote, the drug that is starving Yemen. So what causes this disconnect? Why, in article after article, are journalists expressing such grave concern over a widely used, moderately psychoactive, and usually non-life-threatening plant? The answer, I believe, is a combination of deep cultural bias and an unwillingness to critically examine the way drugs are used in society. So, for the remainder of this episode, let's discuss two of the key talking points about khat and why they may not actually paint an accurate picture of its use or impact on society. These points are as follows. Number 1, khat is an inefficient use of Yemen's agricultural land, requires an enormous amount of water to grow, and feeds nobody. Number 2, khat is a highly addictive drug that has a devastating impact on Yemen's economy and civil society, and a degrading influence on the politics and the morals of its people, where poor men often spend more money financing their addictions than on feeding their families. Both of these talking points, which exist to some extent in nearly every mainstream news article about khat in Yemen, rely at their core on disrespect for the country's cultural traditions, racist drug war hysteria, and a misunderstanding of the factors that have forced Yemen into poverty, most notably the Saudi Arabia-led blockade and bombing campaign. But for clarity's sake, let's take them one at a time. First, let's address the environmental concerns, which have more than a grain of truth at their core. Because Yemen is indeed in a water scarcity crisis, exacerbated by the agricultural industry and fueled by climate change. The country is in a uniquely disadvantaged place when it comes to global warming. A recent study showed it is the 12th least ready country in terms of climate vulnerability, and is also vulnerable to precipitation whiplash, which means the risk of both severe drought and extreme floods are increasing. I don't doubt that whoever ends up governing Yemen after the civil war ends will have to make difficult decisions when it comes to agricultural priorities. On that point, it's worth noting that over 70% of the country's population currently live under Houthi control. I also do not deny that khat is a water-intensive plant. It is a water-intensive plant that is, strictly speaking, non-essential. My issue with the spate of articles I've seen in Western publications is not in the facts of what they're discussing, but rather the conclusion that they've drawn. These articles across the board recognize the gravity of the environmental crisis faced by Yemen, and yet without fail, they always recommend the exact same solution: stop growing khat and replace it with coffee. The problem with this recommendation? Coffee is also super water intensive. Replacing khat with coffee does nothing to slow the rate of groundwater depletion, nor does it address the other primary concern of many who advocate this policy, the fact that khat does not feed anyone and Yemen is experiencing a famine. A recent article published by the Carnegie Endowment declared that khat, quote-unquote, requires significant water and feeds no one. But this article went on to praise efforts to replace it with coffee. Now, some people might claim coffee is a food crop, while khat is not, but this also hides a specific anti-drug bias that we do not apply to coffee due to its cultural ubiquity. Neither crop provides any caloric value to a country in famine, but one is seen as a foreign and degenerate drug of abuse, while the other is seen as an unshakable cultural touchstone. The only difference between the two is that coffee makes a better export crop. But even this is changing as other countries have started exporting khat, and the global khat market is growing. And I also find it hard to take seriously any trade recommendations directed at Yemen from a country actively facilitating its trade blockade. Now, I'm not making the case that khat cultivation on the scale it's currently practiced in Yemen is sustainable. Groundwater tables in the capital city of Sana'a are sinking by 6 to 8 feet per year, and many wells have to be drilled nearly half a mile into the earth to access that groundwater. Yemen is the most water-scarce country in the Arab world, and could be the first country on Earth to run out of water if it does not change course somehow. But I find it telling that the solution proposed by every pundit for over a decade is that Yemen must find other, more productive uses for its limited water supply than khat, which is routinely described as a narcotic that is, and I quote, sucking the country dry. Regardless of what anti-Khat crusaders would have you believe, switching from Khat to coffee will not end Yemen's environmental woes, especially when the Saudi-led coalition has repeatedly destroyed critical water infrastructure in Houthi-controlled regions, including, would you believe it, a 2016 attack on a desalination plant in Mocha, that ancient coffee city we talked about earlier. So there may be no easy solution to Yemen's water crisis, but until the US-backed Saudi-led coalition is willing to end its land, air, and sea blockade, and until international aid organizations are allowed in to help rebuild its decimated infrastructure, forcing Khat farmers to give up their cash crops in favor of another water-intensive commodity sounds a lot like rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic. Well, minus the water. Now let's address the claims that Khat itself is dangerous. It would be one thing if major newspapers were simply claiming that it's unhealthy, because based on all available evidence, they'd be right. Khat does not appear to be good for sleep. Its active alkaloids are indeed amphetamine-like substances. It is demonstrably habit-forming, and may increase the risk of psychiatric and cardiac disorders. Of course, all of these things are true about many other drugs, including alcohol, nicotine, marijuana, even caffeine at high doses. But what about the claim that Khat has a morally and socially corrupting influence, that Yemeni men would rather spend their hard-earned money on a self-destructive habit than on taking care of their loved ones? I find this talking point to be particularly odious. The argument that a plant which has been used safely in a country for hundreds of years is to blame for all the wrongdoings of its people or the squalor in which they now live is a racist and classist trope that the world has seen time and time again. In the United States, many of the staunchest advocates for prohibition of marijuana, heroin, and psychedelics were fervent drinkers who openly admitted to lying about drugs in order to attack political opponents, including this stunning confession from John Ehrlichman, an aide to Richard Nixon, who said as follows: "You want to know what this war on drugs was really about? The Nixon campaign in 1968 and the Nixon White House after that had two enemies, the anti-war left and black people. You understand what I'm saying? We knew we couldn't make it illegal to be either against the war or black, but by getting the public to associate the hippies with marijuana and blacks with heroin, and then criminalizing both heavily, we could disrupt those communities. We could arrest their leaders, raid their homes, break up their meetings, and vilify them night after night on the evening news. Did we know we were lying about the drugs? Of course we did." Then there's the so-called crack cocaine epidemic, which fueled the carceral system by disproportionately targeting poor black communities. Even the prohibitionist temperance movement, going back further, is full of similar classism. Upper-class women saw the beer and wine used by others in their social class as potentially healthy tonics, and enjoyed opium and laudanum in their own free time, but were nonetheless deeply concerned by the effect of gin on the poor and working class. Then there's the anti-opium crackdown, of course, which has its roots in the racist fear that Chinese immigrants would seduce young white women into their opium dens. And even coffee, the now anodyne and ubiquitous stimulant, was ferociously opposed by some women in the 17th and 18th centuries who distributed a pamphlet entitled Women's Petition Against Coffee, arguing that it made their husbands impotent and uninterested in their company. So, time and time again, we see that problems blamed on drug use are rarely actually just about the drugs. If millions of Yemeni men are unable to feed their families, regardless of whether or not they chew khat, that is not an indictment of their personal life choices, but of an international economic system that has failed them. That is poverty on a scale that most of us can hardly fathom. We're talking about a whole country that has been ghettoized, a food desert with 30 million people. In Yemen, poverty is not a result of the choices you've made. Inability to feed your family is also likely not a result of the choices you've made, and it's absurd beyond belief to blame either of these on khat use, especially when the vast majority of khat is grown domestically and sold by Yemeni farmers, and the khat industry affords some of the only stable employment available in the country. The idea that without a khat industry, Yemen would magically fix its economy is laughable. If American journalists and diplomats are so concerned with Yemen's men being able to support their families, again, I repeat myself, they should put pressure on their government to end support for the Saudi coalition's blockade. They should demand an immediate end to all military and diplomatic support to Saudi Arabia, and demand immediate and robust aid be allowed to reach Yemen's starving families, regardless of whether or not the men of those families chew khat. More broadly, the attitude taken by Western newsrooms toward Yemeni khat users is an example of a classist cognitive bias known as socially permissible consumption. This has been backed up in the literature, too. An article from 2020 found that lower-income people are socially permitted to consume less because they are presumed to need less. So the fact that Yemeni men are said to be wasting their days and unproductive, which in and of themselves are value judgments, is blamed on the pastime that they choose as opposed to the lack of economic opportunities in the country. A PBS report from 2018 profiled a young man working as a day laborer in oppressively hot conditions, making only $3 a day. At this rate, it takes a week's work just to make enough to buy a bag of flour, which at the time went for a staggering $17. These are the people the media seems so eager to label as unproductive khat chewers. And when the most economically viable options people have in the country are to become a soldier or grow khat, I can hardly take seriously the opinion of journalists whose job it is to sit in an air-conditioned office and write, quite frankly, poorly researched articles, especially when they chastise the work ethic of an entire ethnic group. There are so many arguments which follow this mold, pointing to a very real social ill and assigning blame to a complete red herring. This can be seen in the writing of many of those who decry khat as a recruitment tool for child soldiers, which both sides of the Yemeni civil war have done. Now, this is horrible, of course. The recruitment and the use of child soldiers is unequivocally illegal under international humanitarian law. There is no question about this. But the idea that children are entering the battlefield for khat alone is simply unsubstantiated. Indeed, the biggest recruitment tools in the last 6 months in Houthi-controlled areas, at the very least, have been the US and UK-led airstrikes on military targets and the ongoing siege and bombardment of the Gaza Strip in Palestine. These geopolitical factors, as well as the fact that the Houthis send food rations to families of soldiers, are likely much more to blame than a psychoactive plant used by 90% of the country's men, whether combatant or non-combatant. All right, with all this in mind, let's have a little bit of fun, and let's take a look at this 2018 article from The Economist. The article is called "The Drug That Is Starving Yemen. Famine in Yemen Could Be Avoided If the Men Chewed Less Khat." All right, we're off to a great start already. Yemen is on the brink of famine, say aid agencies, which often blame the civil war, Saudi Arabia's blockade of northern seaports, and its bombing of vital infrastructure. The government's refusal to pay salaries to employees in rebel-held areas and the depreciation of Yemen's rial mean many cannot afford the food that is available. But one of the biggest causes of hunger often goes unmentioned: a leafy plant called khat. Okay, I love that this article starts with an itemized list of all of the reasons why Yemen is actually starving, and then immediately turns around and implies it's actually because the entire country likes to get stoned. You know, that's like saying the Great Depression was caused by people drinking alcohol, and that's why we needed prohibition. This is that level of cultural analysis. Let's keep going. The weed is Yemen's most popular drug. 90% of men and over a third of women habitually chew its leaves, storing the masticated greenery in their cheek until the narcotic seeps into their bloodstream. In the past, Yemenis might indulge once a week, and the practice was largely confined to the northwest mountains, where khat grows. But following unification in 1990, it spread south. Now, khat markets bustle all over the country. I wonder why Yemenis indulged only once a week in the past and now do it all the time. Wow, I wonder if there's some sort of political reality that the entire country is desperate to escape. Let's continue. Men spend far more feeding their addiction than their families, sometimes $800 a month. I would love to see a source on this statistic, but okay. Rather than searching for weapons and other contraband, soldiers extort bribes at checkpoints to pay for their habit, jacking up transport costs. And while the country runs out of basics, such as wheat, its best farmland is devoted to producing the crop, which is more lucrative. Cultivation of khat is said to be increasing by 12% a year. Officials refer to it as Yemen's Viagra and encourage its use. Taher Ali al-Aqali, so sorry if I butchered that name, the army's chief of staff, says it is quote-unquote our whiskey and claims it gives his men strength to fight. Both sides feed it to their child soldiers. Okay, this is sensationalism. Is it Viagra? Is it whiskey? Well, I don't know. Obviously, we shouldn't be giving either of those things or anything like either of those things to children. But more importantly, we shouldn't be making them fight in wars. The rest kind of seems irrelevant. When local governors in Hadramaut, the largest province in Yemen, tried to revive an old ban on consumption in their offices, they were summoned to Riyadh to join Yemen's president for a communal chew. Only Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula has had any success in banning it. I love how this article says that as if it's a positive thing. Only our brave Al-Qaeda soldiers. It's kind of like that old trope about the brave mujahideen, that fake Rambo quote. Anyway, northern Yemen is the region most under threat of famine, but the Houthi rebels who control it value their monopoly on khat as much as Mr. Hadi does his hold on the country's oil and gas fields. It keeps roads open across enemy lines. Dozens of trucks full of the harvest cross into Marib each day. Taxes on khat also earn both sides in the war big revenues. Recent data are scarce, but back in 2000, the World Bank estimated that khat accounted for 30% of Yemen's economy. Even the hungry cite an advantage. The drug suppresses their appetite, but the absurdity is not lost on all. In the words of a southern official, we're fighting Houthis with our arms and funding them with our mouths. And that's the end of the article. That's it. I had fun. I hope you had fun. Yeah, that's our show for today. Hope you enjoyed. There will be more to come, God willing. And if you're interested, you could follow me on Twitter at drugculturespod or reach out via email at drugculturespodcast@gmail.com. If you learned something, if you appreciated anything you heard, even if you vehemently disagree with some of my takes and want to tell me exactly why I'm wrong, feel free to reach out. I look forward to hearing from you. Have a great evening.